When it comes to video games, I heed the mantra, save often. I've run into the problem of making a mistake or having another similar problem too many times to not feel like I need to save after every semi-important moment. If I wouldn't want a situation to go a different way than the amazing manner that it did, then I'm going to save the game. Once upon a time, I would only have used a single save slot. After all, if I was only trying to make sure that what happened was recorded, why would I need anything more? However, after an instance where there was a corruption in the save data, as well as another time when a glitch became unavoidable regardless of a reload, both of which forced me to either start the entire game over or stop playing, I moved to a 3 save slot system. And it's worked for me for the most part since then. However, there are still times when I create another save slot just to make sure heading in a certain direction is not a mistake that I'll later regret, while being unable to undo that problem. It's the desire to undo a terrible mistake that makes me want to act this way. And it elevates the question asked every time I overwrite the save slot. Are you sure? You do realize that if you continue on with what you're about to do, there will be no going back. This is something that can never be undone. What was before will be lost forever, and you will have to live with the permanent consequences of this choice. Other similar examples of this "are you sure" question popping up could be when you're about to approve an online purchase. By saying, "yes, I'm sure," that amount of money will be charged to you, even if it's more than you can really afford. Or maybe the example of deleting photos from your phone. Once you agree to the question of "are you sure," that picture will only live on in your own personal memory because there's no chance of a non-tech genius getting that back. That question, which has been repeated so constantly in our present lives that we hardly even read it anymore, is there to press upon us the permanence of the action that we're about to undertake. This is the point of no return, and there will be no going back if you do this. Take one last reflection on the consequences. Are you sure? Up until the point in Israelite history where we've gotten in the book of Samuel, leadership of the people has been based off of the aged wisdom of the elders and the occasional raising of a chosen person empowered by God for a specific purpose. God raised Moses and Aaron to free his people from slavery in Egypt and become a chosen nation. Then God used Joshua to lead the people into major victories in the conquest of the Promised Land. And then whenever enemies oppressed the Israelites enough that they finally returned from their idolatrous sins and toward their actual God, he would raise up a deliverer called a judge. We've even seen this so far in this sermon series called A Song of Failures and Hope. The priest Eli was a judge, even though he continually turned a blind eye away from the sinful actions of his sons. And in the last chapter, we saw that the prophet Samuel was also one of these spirit-empowered deliverers referred to as judges. He called the Israelites away from their idolatry, and when the Philistines set themselves in battle lines against the people, they called upon Samuel to be their intercessor. And in their amazing reliance on God in that moment, the God who can fight the battle himself thundered against the Philistines. The Israelites only had to mop up the last vestiges of the enemy. But the years passed between that chapter and the one that we'll look at for this sermon in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And the people forgot the value of having this system of leadership. They let the value of having God be their king and fight their battles fall to the wayside. After that amazing moment of getting it right in chapter 7, they returned immediately back to doing the wrong thing. And this time, their choice changed the history of their people forever. Regardless of the question that Samuel asks them, "Are you sure?" And with their agreement to the consequences, there would be no going back. But we're getting a little ahead of the story. So let's head back to the beginning of the chapter, because there's a little bit of setup for this episode in the tale. And that begins with what might even sound a little bit like a rerun. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." We've only just reached the 8th chapter in the book bearing his name, and Samuel is already considered elderly. These 4 story arcs have been moving fast so far. I mean, Eli's already died, and Samuel's considered old here, even though he'll keep kicking around for quite a bit more of the first half of this book. After all, God still has a lot of work to do through the prophet's life. The next chapter is when we'll be introduced to Saul, and not much long after that, David's arc will begin his upward climb. But let's not forget the importance of the story arcs. Each of these men was held in the regard of rising hope for the people of Israel at one point in time in their lives. But the time comes for each of them when that uplifting story hits its peak, and then failure sets in, and the fall begins its gradual descent. It just so happens that Samuel's experience of failure is the impetus for the action that leads to Israel to be asked the question, "Are you sure?" And here is where it kind of feels like a rerun. Samuel had 2 sons, named Joel and Abijah, but they didn't walk in the ways of their father. As a matter of fact, they might have taken up the same role as their father, but they perverted that role, even extorting the people whom they were supposed to serve. It sounds familiar because other than the names being different, it's basically Eli's story. Samuel had seen with his own eyes the sins of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. He'd even been used as the good example against their bad one earlier on in the book. And God had used Samuel's prophecy against the pair of brothers to reiterate to Eli the curse placed upon his house. And yet Samuel fell into the very same problem as Eli. His sons lusted after dishonest gain. They used the power and prestige of their father's name to make their own lives better, instead of serving the people by helping them serve their God. Sure, maybe Samuel tried his best to train the boys in the ways of God. He named one Joel, which means Yahweh is God, and the other Abijah, meaning Yahweh is my father. By their very names, Samuel reminded them and the people that Yahweh alone is the God of Israel, not the idols of the surrounding culture, and that Yahweh is the one whom we should respect as our protector and provider. But something got lost along the way. They forgot to listen to what their names actually meant, and they acted as if they were their own God. Maybe we could forgive Samuel for the failures of his sons. After all, children don't always hold to the faith of their parents. There are hundreds of stories like that, even today. But the problem comes in the fact that Samuel authenticated his sons' position. He made them judges over Israel. He decided it was a good idea to name his rebellious sons as successors to his role, instead of waiting for God to raise up the next leader when the time came. Maybe Samuel felt like this was in the best interest of the Israelites. Maybe he had fallen into the trap of the surrounding kings, where leadership is considered as one of lineage, and thus his sons obviously had to take on his leadership role, regardless of their ability to do so with the same faithfulness. And maybe he even realized his mistake and sent the pair someplace where their sinful actions would have the least ramifications. The text says that they were judges in Beersheba. That city, or rather I should say town, is the southernmost one of the nation, and it was hardly even more than a settlement during that point in time in Israelite history. Not overly important and way off on the edge. Maybe there was some reason why he sent them there after he realized his mistake. We can't really know how much of those maybes are true. But what we can know is that this is the beginning of the decline of Samuel's story arc. And this is what caused the elders of Israel to approach Samuel for a change in leadership. The elders came to Samuel and said, "You're old. Imagine a bunch of gray hairs coming to you and commenting on how old you are. You'd feel ancient, I'm sure." But they were saying more than that as well. Their point was that there would soon be a vacancy in the leadership role of the nation, at least as far as a human leader goes. And while Samuel had been good for the nation, his sons would never do. These wizened leaders of the tribes had lived through the tyranny of Hophni and Phinehas just as much as Samuel had, and they didn't want to have to live through the sequel of Samuel's sons. They wanted a point man, someone to run to when problems and enemies arose. While in verse 5, they say that they want to be like the other nations, the rest of their motivations are stated later on in verse 20. Their hope was to have someone to fight their battles, someone who would take on the responsibility of protecting the nation, someone whom they could look to in their fear and say, "He'll save us." They wanted a hero. But what they had forgotten was that God already held that role. It was He who thundered against the Philistines, routing that enemy before a single Israelite sword had lifted from its scabbard. And before that, God alone had waged a war through a solo mission against the Philistines when they'd taken the Ark of the Covenant. Those elders wanted someone to turn to when problems arose, but refused to realize that they already had one. We do this too. We're not looking for a king, per se, but some of us might be turning to the government to bail us out of the situations, instead of relying on God and the people He raises up around us. The thought being that government subsidies are the only thing that can help us, when living in community with those who hold to the same faith is actually the biblically approved method. We might look to money itself, whether that's the money that's actually in our bank accounts, or the money we wish was there, or the ill-gotten gains that we'll cheat and steal from others. We'll look to money instead of being content with what we have and living within our means. That's using the ideas of success that our culture defines, instead of the success of faithfulness with God. We might feel the need to be accepted and seek it from people who see us more as just another mark who can be used for their selfish desires, instead of being the valuable beloved of the God who crafted us for good, seeking approval that needs to be earned, instead of one granted to us merely for being created in the image of our God. It's easy for us to let the familiar become the forgotten, and then seek something more, something else, something that will end up as a worse substitute of what we already had to begin with. So we do, far too often. And it's what the Israelites did at this point in time in their history. They wanted reassurance that they would be protected, someone whom they could manipulate to do the things their way and in their time, someone unlike the God who chose them, because they could not control him. He thundered when he was ready, not when his people forced him to. But in the midst of the fall from rising hope as Samuel might be, he remained in connection with God. And the prophet knew that this request from the people was ridiculous and wrong and evil. Sure, his sons were not the way to go, but a king was also not the best way. And so he turned to God, only to find a surprising response from him. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 6 to 9. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." The phrase, "the thing displeased Samuel," just doesn't carry the weight I feel like it needs to in this situation. I mean, I see a man staring off into the middle distance, shaking his head as he throws his hands up in frustration, possibly letting out a growl of a sigh. These people don't know what they're asking. But instead of going into a depression because they're rejecting the prophet's leadership, or seeking some way to solidify his power base, Samuel does the best thing and cries out to God. He prays. He expresses his frustration and doubts to God. He asks his king, the one who empowers Samuel's leadership role, to save his people from this mistake. But God's answer to the prophet surprises him. "Hey Samuel, you remember how when I called you to this role that I promised I would do amazing things that would cause the ears of all who hear to tingle? How I would slacken the jaws of all who saw my works? Well, I didn't just mean defeating the Philistines by myself. I have a plan. And it means that we have to give the Israelites what they want. Give them a king, Samuel." In verses 7 to 8, God consoles his prophet in the midst of this rejection, even as he tells the man that he's not surprised at the event. Israel has constantly rejected the God who chose them, and forsaken his ways. From the time he first escorted them out of Egypt right up to that very day, they'd had a wandering eye away from the God who saved them and protected them and gave them everything that they needed. It hadn't even been a couple of days after God told the Israelites that he was making them a chosen nation, while the thunderous cloud of God rested on Mount Sinai in the very presence of his people, and they were already trying to worship a golden calf, which supposedly represented Yahweh, even though he told them not to worship any graven image. Later on, when the Israelites had refused to believe that God would lead them to the victory in the promised land, and God had to force them to wander in the wilderness so that a faithful generation might be given the promise, the people still complained and thought about going back to Egypt. And this was even though God had miraculously provided food and water throughout the 40 years. Even their clothes and sandals didn't wear out. I mean, talk about providing everything for them. Yet they still wanted to go back, refuse the ways of God. And even that next generation forgot to ask God for wisdom in performing the justice of God against the idolatrous nations that inhabited the promised land. They refused to wipe out all the nations who had been judged by God. Once they were even tricked by one of those nations into letting them live. The list could go on and on. I mean, every judge listed in the book of Judges was raised to save the people from another consequence of the sinful rejection of their God. This rejection was no surprise to God. Just another in a long line of rejection after rejection after rejection. And just like the others, he was going to use it for his own purpose. He was going to use this evil, this wrongdoing, for his good, for his glory, for the rising hope that would be placed in Jesus. Our Savior's body was a physical descendant of a king that God would raise because of this request. God would be recognized as king by many, even as he took the form of a descendant of a human king. He would use this for his good, for his glory, and for our salvation. This was God's plan, salvation for all who bowed before this God-man king crowned on a cross. But he didn't let Samuel in on all of it. Instead, God consoled his prophet. This isn't a rejection of you or your position in my plan, Samuel. No, they've rejected me, like they always have. And like I always have, I will give them over to the consequences of their choice. But do this one thing for me, Samuel. Remind them that there will be permanent consequences to this request, many of which they will not like. And so God tells Samuel to ask the people, "Are you sure?" Knowing full well that they were going to click on the yes, strike that Y key, sign on the dotted line without really reading the full contract, all because they thought they were getting the better end of this deal. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 to 18. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you on that day." Samuel returns to the Israelites, to the elders who asked him for a king, and in his words we see a refrain that should have scared the people away from this desire. 3 little words, repeated over and over again, that served as their warning. He will take. The Israelites had already had a provider and king in God. He did not need anything from the people in order to do that job. But a human king doesn't have God's power and abilities and resources. God is able to give and give and give without running out. But a human king needs infrastructure, and infrastructure needs to take, and take, and take. And there's nowhere else for a human leadership to take than from the people under its leadership. That's the way of human-led politics. Take, and take, and take. These elders had thought that having a human as a point man would be for their benefit, without having to give a thing. They thought that they could treat the king like they treated God, being unfaithful all that they wanted, and then when problems arose, they could rely on him to do his job. Just please help us, please save us, even though we've been rejecting you for over and over and over again. But that's not how kings work. It's not how any human leadership works. Those being protected need to give and give and give all the way through the good times, so that when the bad times arise, their leaders have the ability to do the job of protecting their people. And that giving comes through the future generation being trained as soldiers and captains and generals, being trained as bodyguards for the king, because the transition of power is often the most turbulent. So you don't want the king to die. The next generation will be made to serve as people who continue the infrastructure of the king. Farmers to feed the king and his advisors and his army, weapon makers to arm them, artisans to keep them in the refineries of their royal positions, and much more. He will take your sons and your daughters, and you will have no recourse but to give or be put to death as a traitor. Not only that, but he will take your possessions from you, your lands, your vineyards, your orchards, your servants, your beasts of burden, your flocks. He will take them as taxes so that he can protect you. And it won't be whatever you have left that he'll take, like you've tried to do to God. No, he will take the best, the highest quality, the most choice. And you'll only get the dredges, the leftover scraps, like the wild dogs who scrabble over a bone. He will take your possessions, and you could do nothing but give, or die by his sword. Samuel ends his "Are you sure?" with a warning that when the consequences get bad enough that the people cry out to God about their oppression of their king, the one whom they chose themselves, God will not send a judge to save them. There's no going back to the old system of sin, get oppressed, repent, wait for God to save, and repeat. If they wanted a point man, then through that point man would be the only way that they would be saved. And if that king wasn't faithful to God, if he didn't listen to God's directions to save, then I guess rescue wouldn't come that time. Because when you want a point man, God will work through them. Salvation won't come the way that it used to. This is what the Israelites were asking for. But because they saw only the good parts of having a point man, and just yeah and yada yada the whole warning, they clicked on the yes without really reading what was going to happen, without understanding what clicking on yes meant. And then they had to proceed on with a save slot that no longer held the safety that they thought it would. The time would come when they would try to reload, only to find out that they had made a horrible mistake that day. And there's no restarting this game of life. But that moment of regret would come later on in their history. For now, let's look at their fateful click of not heeding the warning. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 19 to 22. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And when Samuel heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey their voice and make them a king." Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Go every man to his city." They said that they were sure that a king was a way to go. No, they would not listen to the warning. Yes, they were sure that this action was exactly what they wanted. They would have a king. Be like the other nations who had a point man to judge and lead and fight their battles. They wanted a human being whom they thought they could manipulate like they wanted God to act, but would find that their desires would not be the way that it worked. God had already held that position, already would judge and lead and fight. He already saved and proved it by his actions, over and over again. But because the people preferred their own way instead of the ways of God, because they wanted a faithful leader while being a faithless people, and no consequence for it, they would soon learn that it would never work that way, and that they had actually traded the best option for a lesser one. Samuel heard their refusal to listen to his warning like God had told him would happen, and he returned to God with their response. And God shrugged his shoulders with a shake of his head. "Give them what they want, Samuel. Give them what they're asking for. Give them a king. Write over that save slot. Approve that purchase. Delete that data." They clicked on yes. So go ahead and do it. We both know that this is a terrible decision, but they're not going to learn any other way. They might be sure, but they are wrong. We'll see the first king raised in the next chapter, but that's for the next sermon. So we should take some time to see what this whole lesson for the Israelites can teach us. Sometimes God allows us to choose the failure so that he can lead us to the hope he has ready for us. When we turn a blind eye to the good that he already has provided for us, it'll often take drastic experiences for us to see the truth, for us to see what he really wants to give us, to see what we have been rejecting. And when that happens, we see God as unloving or unable because he doesn't do things our way, the way that we see the cultures around us do them. And so we turn to other options, to the answers that those around us turn, without the Creator's guiding hand. And all that we'll discover is the failure of unsuccessful answers. Hope doesn't come from a human being, though that is often the place we seek it. A friend, a lover, a family member, a political leader, even ourselves. Hope only comes from God. He might use a human for his purpose, bring about hope through a person, but it comes from him alone. And I think one of the reasons why God brought about our greatest hope, the hope that leads to our rescue from sin and death, through the enfleshment of himself in the person of Jesus. The reason why he did that is because a physical person is the only place that we would look for the hope that he wants to give us. You want to look at a person? I'll give you a person. But you still better do things my way. We don't have to look beyond Jesus to find hope. The failures we've experienced, the losses because others have let us down, might have led us to a position of wondering if hope truly exists. And if we continue to seek hope through the answers that the culture around us provides, we will meet failure after failure again. It is in Jesus that we find hope, true and real hope, hope that will never fail us. So for those who've yet to come to Jesus, find hope in the only place that can actually give it. There's not much more I can say than that. For those of us who've already come to him, don't let the false answers of the people around us lead you into a situation where there will be lasting consequences that you won't like. We already have a king. We already have a judge. We already have a savior. We don't need to go anywhere else looking for another. Hear these words for what they are. A warning that you might be seeking to do what has permanent consequences. Don't just yeah the words. The warning. We may have seen these words 1,000,000 times before, but they are always important to fully comprehend the consequences. Are you sure?